Hunter finds a horse among wolves, but their unsettling reaction will haunt him forever. It was a quiet, unsettling evening in the small, isolated village of Ashford. Nestled deep within the dense forest, the village was often shrouded in mist, with towering trees blocking out the sun and creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. The forest here was ancient, old enough to hold secrets and stories whispered among the villagers for generations. It was a place where even the most experienced hunter would tread carefully, unsure of what lay hidden beneath the silence. The village had always been a peaceful one, the people living simple, ordinary lives, untouched by the outside world. But that all changed when something unexplainable happened in the forest, an event that would change the way they viewed nature, and their very place within it. It all started with the sightings. A local woodsman, Finn, known for his quiet demeanor and deep knowledge of the forest, stumbled upon an unbelievable scene one foggy morning. His eyes widened as he watched from a distance, his breath caught in his throat. A horse, pale and graceful, stood in the center of a clearing, surrounded by a pack of wolves. But these wolves weren't acting like any predators Finn had ever seen. They weren't prowling or snarling. No, they were standing in formation around the horse, watching it, protecting it. He rubbed his eyes, convinced it was some trick of the light or the result of a tired mind. But when he blinked, the scene remained. The wolves' golden eyes shimmered in the dim light, not with hunger, but with something else, something far more puzzling. The news spread fast in the village, like wildfire. Every whisper and passing glance seemed to center on the strange occurrence in the woods. Some believed it was a sign, a mysterious omen. Others claimed it was some sort of trick of the mind. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. No one had ever seen wolves behave this way. The pack, usually known for their ferocity and wild nature, was suddenly acting protective? As the news traveled, it reached the outside world. Social media buzzed with the mysterious reports, and soon national news outlets picked up the story. The tale of a horse surrounded by wolves in the deep forest of Ashford intrigued many, but it also sparked the curiosity of someone who had no interest in tales, only in facts. Entered Duncan Gray, a hunter renowned for his skill and no-nonsense approach to wildlife. Known across the country for his precise tracking and expertise in the wilderness, Duncan was the kind of man who respected nature but had little patience for what he considered to be mere superstition. He had heard rumors of the horses and wolves, and although he dismissed them at first, his curiosity soon grew. He had seen countless things in the wild, but this was something different. The mystery gnawed at him. How could wolves, natural predators, be protecting a horse? It didn't make sense. The answer was elusive, but Duncan, never one to shy away from a challenge, knew one thing for sure. He had to see it for himself. So, he packed his gear, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and set off for Ashford. As the village loomed in the distance, Duncan couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. It was a feeling he didn't often get, but something told him this would be unlike any hunt he'd ever been on. The villagers spoke of the forest with reverence and fear, some even urging Duncan to turn back. But he ignored their warnings. He wasn't afraid of the woods. He was a man of logic and reason. Nature would reveal itself to him, he believed. The forest greeted him like an old, unfamiliar friend, silent, heavy with secrets. The trees towered over him, their leaves rustling as if whispering stories of the past. And then, as if the forest itself had been waiting for him, Duncan found the tracks. They were fresh, the unmistakable signs of wolves, wide, deep paw prints etched into the earth. But there was something else, something that made Duncan pause. The tracks of a horse. A single, solitary set of hoof prints. They moved in tandem, intertwined with the wolf tracks, as though they had been walking together. Curiosity gripped him, urging him forward. What could this mean? Why were these creatures walking together? Duncan Gray's boots crunched the dry leaves beneath him as he walked along the narrow dirt road leading into Ashford. The village was quiet, almost too quiet. The type of place where every person knew every other person's business, and where even the slightest disruption would send ripples through the community. Duncan wasn't used to such an atmosphere. He was from a larger town, where the hustle and bustle of city life drowned out the subtle whispers of nature. But here, in Ashford, everything seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, something ancient, something powerful. As he entered the village, a cool breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint scent of pine and wet earth. Duncan paused for a moment, inhaling deeply. It felt different. A sharp contrast to the clear, predictable air of the open plains he was used to. He made his way to the local inn, where the villagers had gathered to discuss the strange happenings in the forest. Most of them looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He was an outsider, after all. The locals were a quiet bunch, and strangers in their midst were often met with suspicion. At the inn's small wooden bar, Duncan sat down with a rough, weathered man named Gordon, who had spent his entire life in Ashford. Gordon's eyes were tired, as though he'd seen more than his fair share of mysteries. He leaned in close to Duncan, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "You hear about the wolves?" Gordon asked, his voice thick with a blend of awe and caution. "Protecting the horse, they say. It ain't right. Wolves don't do that. Not unless something strange is happening." Duncan nodded slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't what he had expected. He had heard about the wolves' unusual behavior from the villagers, but hearing it firsthand, especially from someone as experienced as Gordon, made the whole thing seem even more bizarre. "I've been tracking these wolves for years," Gordon continued, his eyes narrowing. "But I've never seen anything like this. They're wild, unpredictable. But this, protecting a horse? It's like they've been tamed by something more powerful than instinct." Duncan took a swig of his drink, mulling over Gordon's words. He didn't believe in omens or signs, but there was something here, something that demanded answers. And Duncan Gray was a man who lived for the truth. "Where exactly did you see them?" Duncan asked, his voice firm. "Where can I find them?" Gordon looked up, his gaze shifting toward the distant trees, and then back to Duncan. "Just follow the main path west of here, deeper into the woods. But be careful. The forest has a way of changing things. It's not like the plains you're used to. It has its own rules." Duncan nodded, standing up. His expression was resolute. He didn't believe in superstition or fear. But Gordon's warning, the way the villagers spoke, the mysterious connection between the horse and wolves, it was all too strange to ignore. As evening fell, Duncan made his way to the outskirts of the village. The moon was just beginning to rise, casting a silver glow over the landscape. The cool night air bit at his skin, and the scent of wet leaves filled his nostrils. The forest loomed ahead, dense and wild, its trees forming a canopy that obscured the stars above. Duncan stood for a moment, staring into the shadows of the forest. The hunt was different here. There was no clear path, no predictable movement of animals. Here, the forest itself was the hunter. The very thought of it made his heart beat faster, his pulse quickening with anticipation. This was the unknown, something Duncan hadn't faced in years. He checked his gear one last time. His rifle was secured, his knives sharp, and a compass fastened tightly to his belt. Every tool had its purpose. As a hunter, Duncan knew that preparation was key. But deep down, he also knew that this wasn't going to be a typical hunt. He wasn't out here for sport. He wasn't here to claim trophies or prove himself. This was something more. With a steady breath, he set out, the soft crunch of leaves under his boots echoing in the quiet night. The path before him grew narrower and more difficult to follow with each step, the trees pressing in around him. His every movement was calculated, instinctual. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The deeper he ventured, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to change. The usual rustling of small creatures, the chirping of insects, all disappeared. It was as though the forest itself had gone still, holding its breath. Duncan paused, scanning the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been hunting for years, but this felt different. It wasn't just the unknown. It was the presence in the air. Something he couldn't quite place. Something alive. He continued, undeterred. The wolves had to be close. Duncan pushed forward through the thick forest, the air growing heavier as he neared the heart of the wilderness. The path he was following had become indistinct, swallowed by dense undergrowth, but the tracks were still fresh, guiding him onward. The wolves' paw prints mixed with the horse's hoof prints, both sets of tracks leading deeper into the forest, as though the creatures were moving together in an unspoken alliance. As Duncan walked, the silence of the forest grew more pronounced. The usual sounds of rustling leaves or distant animal calls were gone. There was only the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the earth and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. His senses were on high alert, every muscle in his body tense, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, the first hint of movement caught his attention. Duncan froze, his hand instinctively brushing against the rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes scanned the undergrowth, and he saw them. Glowing eyes piercing the darkness. A pair of wolves, low to the ground, moving in a synchronized fashion, their gaze locked on him. But unlike the predatory glint he was accustomed to seeing in their eyes, there was something different in these wolves' expressions. Curiosity, perhaps, or even recognition? A low growl rumbled from the back of the pack, but instead of charging, the wolves simply stared, their eyes unwavering. Duncan held his breath, his heart pounding. This wasn't what he expected. Suddenly, through the trees, the horse appeared, graceful, calm, and moving with purpose. It stepped into the clearing, its mane flowing like a river of silver under the moonlight. But it wasn't afraid. The wolves didn't surround it like prey. No, they parted for it, forming a loose circle, as if to protect it, ensuring no harm would come near. Duncan's grip on his rifle tightened, but his body refused to move. The scene was surreal. He had never witnessed anything like it in all his years of hunting. The wolves were supposed to be fierce, wild creatures, predators that ruled the forests. Yet here they were, forming an alliance with a prey animal. And not just any prey animal, but a horse. As Duncan stood in the shadows, he felt a strange chill creep up his spine. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The wolves' behavior was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was as if they were guarding the horse. The horse, its dark eyes reflecting the moonlight, turned its head slowly in Duncan's direction. It took a step forward, the wolves following its lead, their eyes still locked onto him. Duncan couldn't tear his gaze away. What was this? What was going on in the depths of this forest? It was as though the laws of nature were being rewritten right in front of him. The moment felt like an eternity. The forest was deathly silent, except for the soft rustling of the wolves' fur as they moved with a grace that seemed unnatural. Duncan's heart raced, his mind torn between awe and disbelief. The horse, its movements graceful and calculated, stepped closer to Duncan, its eyes never leaving his. The wolves didn't flinch, didn't growl. They simply watched. For a brief moment, Duncan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear, but not the kind of fear that came from being hunted. This was something different, something far deeper, something that made him question everything he had ever known about nature. Duncan stood still, unable to move, caught in the midst of this strange encounter. His rifle felt heavy on his shoulder, his fingers twitching as if they wanted to raise it, to end this mystery with one swift pull of the trigger. But something in his gut stopped him. The wolves were not attacking. They were not even growling anymore. They were observing, protecting. And the horse wasn't afraid. It wasn't trembling in the face of danger. It was calm, poised, almost enthralled by the presence of the wolves. Duncan's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. In all his years of tracking, hunting, and studying animals, never had he encountered such an inexplicable situation. This wasn't nature, as he knew it. This wasn't the wild he had come to understand through his years of expertise. He had always believed that nature was straightforward. A predator would chase its prey, and the cycle of life would continue. But this defied all logic. The wolves weren't acting out of hunger. They weren't even acting out of instinct. No, there was something deeper at play here. Was it possible that there was a bond between the horse and the wolves? Something that had developed in this forest? Something that no human had ever witnessed before? The thought sent a shiver down Duncan's spine. If this was true, it would change everything he thought he knew about the wild. But then, a nagging voice in his head reminded him of his original purpose. He had come here to investigate, to prove that nature, in its rawest form, was a force that could be controlled. The hunter in him had always prided himself on understanding the wild, on being the one who could predict the movements of animals and track them with precision. Yet, standing before him now, Duncan felt utterly powerless. The scene unfolding before his eyes was not something he could control, and that scared him. For the first time in his career, Duncan found himself questioning his own beliefs. Should he raise his rifle? Should he end the mystery before it could deepen? Or should he step back and allow nature to unfold on its own terms, without interference? His heart pounded in his chest as he stood at the crossroads between logic and something far more powerful, something beyond his understanding. As the horse took another step forward, its eyes never leaving his, Duncan knew that this moment would change him. Whether he chose to step into the unknown or leave it behind would determine more than just the outcome of this strange encounter. It would determine his place in the vast, uncharted wilderness. The tension in the air grew thicker, almost suffocating, as Duncan remained frozen, locked in place by the powerful gaze of the horse and the wolves. The forest was eerily still, with only the occasional rustling of leaves carried by the wind. Every breath Duncan took seemed louder than the last, and his mind was racing, caught between his hunter instincts and the strange, profound mystery unfolding before him. Then, suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the silence, the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping underfoot. It was subtle, but enough to shatter the stillness. Duncan's heart skipped a beat, and his eyes shot to the source of the sound. his body tensed, preparing for what might come next. The wolves reacted immediately. Their ears perked up, their bodies stiffened, and they turned in unison toward the direction of the noise. Their eyes narrowed, tracking the movement. It was clear they had heard the disturbance as well, and their focus shifted entirely from Duncan to the unknown intruder. Duncan's grip on his rifle tightened as he instinctively took a step back, trying to melt into the shadows, hoping the wolves wouldn't notice his presence. He knew that if they did, there was no escaping them. But as he retreated, he noticed something extraordinary. The horse, which had been so calm and composed, suddenly lifted its head high and turned its gaze toward the trees where the sound had originated. The moment stretched out, unbearable in its silence. Duncan held his breath, barely daring to blink, waiting for the wolves to react, for the tension to snap. Would they charge, attack the intruder, or would they maintain their eerie calm? And most importantly, would the horse remain at the center of it all, as if tethered by some invisible force to the wolves? But as the seconds ticked by, something unexpected happened. Without warning, the horse's entire posture shifted. It stepped forward, its hooves soft against the forest floor, and without a hint of fear, it approached the wolves, directly into the middle of their protective circle. The wolves, who moments ago were on high alert, now seemed to ease, their tense bodies relaxing. The horse didn't break stride, moving with quiet confidence as it walked through the pack, heading straight toward the sound of the broken branch. Duncan could hardly believe his eyes. The wolves, normally predators, vicious and unyielding, were now secondary to the horse. They did not attack, did not growl or show aggression. Instead, they followed the horse's lead, their movements almost reverent. The horse, unafraid and undeterred by the unknown, continued its steady advance into the shadows of the forest, leading the pack as if it were one of them. It was as if the horse was guiding them, as if the very nature of the forest had shifted, and the roles of predator and prey had been reversed. Duncan's mouth went dry as he stood there, utterly stunned. This was not what he had come for. He had come to prove his prowess as a hunter, to track and uncover the truth behind a strange anomaly. But this was not just an anomaly. It was a profound shift, a spectacle of nature so far removed from anything he had ever experienced that it left him feeling small, insignificant in comparison. For the first time in his life, Duncan was not the one in control of the situation. He had no weapons, no tools, nothing but his senses, and the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The horse, this noble, majestic creature, was at the center of everything. And Duncan realized, with a sudden clarity, that whatever was happening in this forest, it was beyond his understanding. This was nature in its purest, most untamed form. The wolves now moved as one, following the horse as it continued its steady march through the forest. They no longer acted as predators. They acted as guardians, as protectors. And Duncan, watching from the shadows, could feel the weight of his presence, as if the forest itself was aware of him. For a long moment, time seemed to stand still. The only sound in the air was the soft shuffle of the wolves' paws and the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves on the earth. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of purpose, as if the forest itself had become something otherworldly, an ancient place where the rules of nature were being rewritten. Duncan swallowed hard, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. The path he had set out on, the one that had once seemed so clear, seeking out the horse, proving his skills as a hunter, showing that he could tame the wild, now felt utterly irrelevant. The truth was no longer in his hands. It was in the hooves of the horse and the eyes of the wolves. And in that moment, Duncan realized that the forest, this mystery, wasn't something to be conquered. It was something to be respected, to be witnessed. It was a force that defied human understanding, something that no hunter, no matter how skilled, could ever hope to control. The horse paused, turning its head slightly, its eyes meeting Duncan's. There was no fear in its gaze, only a quiet understanding. As if it knew, as if it had always known that this moment would come. And in that brief, silent exchange, Duncan felt a shift within himself. The weight of his purpose, his old motivations, seemed to evaporate. He wasn't here to hunt. He wasn't here to control the wilderness. He was here to witness something far greater than himself. The wolves, now fully settled around the horse, seemed to sense the change in the air as well. They no longer watched with suspicion. They watched with patience, with trust. And in that trust, Duncan found the peace he had been searching for. The peace he hadn't realized he needed until this very moment. Duncan stood there in the stillness, his senses overwhelmed by the quiet power of the moment. Everything he thought he understood about nature, about the roles of predator and prey, of hunter and hunted, seemed to dissolve in the presence of this extraordinary scene. The wolves, who had always been seen as the embodiment of wild aggression, were now protectors, guardians of a horse that, in any other scenario, would have been considered their prey. But here, in this quiet corner of the forest, the boundaries of nature had blurred, and Duncan was no longer sure where he stood. The horse continued to move with an otherworldly grace, its coat shimmering under the pale light filtering through the trees. The wolves followed without hesitation, their movements synchronized with the horse's every step, as if they were one entity, connected by a force greater than anything Duncan could comprehend. The pack's protective behavior was both beautiful and unsettling. The horse was not a symbol of vulnerability here, it was a symbol of unity, of strength, of something primal and ancient that Duncan had never encountered before. As Duncan stood there, lost in the sight before him, something deep inside him began to stir. He thought back to his earlier motivations, the reason he had come to Ashford. He had come to prove himself, to showcase his skills as a hunter, to understand the forest and its creatures, and to assert his control over this wild world. But as the seconds passed, he realized that all of that was meaningless in the face of what he was witnessing now. The world of dominance he had once known, where the hunter controlled the game, had crumbled. Nature had shown him a different side, one that he had never considered. He thought of the people back home, of the other hunters he knew, who believed they could master the forest, tame its creatures, and conquer its mysteries. But none of them had ever experienced something like this. None of them had ever seen the harmony between predator and prey, between life and death, like he was seeing now. The wolves, the horse. This entire encounter was an intricate dance of nature, where survival wasn't about domination, but about understanding, balance, and respect. Duncan's mind swirled with the profound truth that he was witnessing. Nature wasn't a force to be tamed, it was a force to be revered. In that moment, he understood that he was not meant to conquer it. He was meant to observe, to learn, and to respect the delicate threads that connected all creatures, all living things, in a vast web of existence. As the horse and wolves moved deeper into the forest, Duncan felt an overwhelming sense of calm settle over him. The hunger for control that had driven him for so long was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, abiding respect for the creatures he had come to hunt, and for the wilderness that had been his adversary for so long. His heart felt lighter, his purpose shifting. He no longer wanted to prove his prowess as a hunter. Instead, he wanted to protect what he had just witnessed, to preserve the sanctity of this rare and beautiful moment in time. He took a slow, deliberate step back, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that hung in the air. As much as he longed to stay, to watch, to learn more about the bond between the horse and the wolves, he knew that his presence was no longer welcome. He was an outsider, an intruder in a world that had its own rhythm, its own language, its own laws. This was not a place for him to interfere. Duncan reached down, his hand trembling slightly as he picked up the rifle he had dropped. It felt heavier now, as if its weight had doubled, symbolizing the burden of his past actions. He had carried this weapon for so long, relying on it as a tool of survival, of dominance. But now it felt foreign, out of place in the quiet, sacred space of the forest. His fingers lingered on the trigger, but he didn't feel the urge to raise it. There was no enemy to hunt here, no game to pursue. The rifle felt like an artifact from another life, one he no longer wished to be part of. With a deep sigh, Duncan slowly lowered the rifle and dropped the bullets one by one to the forest floor. The sound of each bullet hitting the earth felt like the release of years of tension, the shedding of a skin that had once defined him. The weight that had burdened his shoulders for so long began to lift, and he felt a profound sense of peace, a kind of release he hadn't known he needed. He turned and began to walk away, his steps slow and deliberate. As he moved deeper into the forest, leaving behind the extraordinary scene of the horse and wolves, Duncan felt the forest close around him. He wasn't walking in fear or retreat, but in acknowledgement of the beauty and complexity of nature, of the lesson he had learned, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The mysterious bond between the horse and the wolves became more than just an extraordinary tale in the village of Ashford. It became part of the fabric of its history. Every corner of the village held a memory of that unforgettable event, and the story was passed down through generations. The children, who had grown up hearing the story of the horse and the wolves, shared it with their own children, and so on. Every retelling added a layer of reverence to the story, as it became a symbol of the forest's untold mysteries and the harmony that existed in the wild. It was a story not of fear, but of awe, not of conquest, but of respect. And the village, once simple and quiet, grew proud of the extraordinary event that had happened on their doorstep. Locals began to view the forest with a newfound reverence, knowing that it held secrets far beyond their understanding. People visited Ashford from far and wide, hoping to catch a glimpse of the place where nature had shown its true face. The story became an emblem of the village, a testament to the mysterious beauty of the natural world. Though the horse and wolves never returned, their legacy lived on, forever embedded in the heart of the village. Ashford became known as the place where humanity's understanding of nature was reshaped, a place where the wild was not to be feared or conquered, but respected and protected. As Duncan sat by the edge of the forest, years after his life had shifted course, he thought about the legacy of that extraordinary encounter. He had come to Ashford as a hunter, a man seeking to dominate nature, but he had left with a deep understanding of its delicate balance. The encounter with the horse and wolves had changed everything for him. It had taught him that there was more to life than mastery and control. There was beauty in vulnerability, strength in unity, and power in silence. The memory of that moment, the way the wolves had protected the horse, stayed with him always, like a gentle whisper on the wind. Duncan had seen the wild, not through the eyes of a conqueror, but through the eyes of a participant in the greater tapestry of life. He no longer needed to prove his worth through domination or hunting. Instead, he had found his place as a guardian of the forest, a protector of the creatures who inhabited it. The world, he had come to understand, was not a series of separate battles to be won, but a vast, interconnected ecosystem where every creature played its part. And perhaps, just perhaps, the horse and wolves had been sent to show him that there was more to the world than he could ever comprehend, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest, Duncan felt a deep sense of peace. He had become part of the story too, a quiet witness to the untold beauty of nature, a man forever changed by the legacy of the horse and the wolves. The village of Ashford would continue to tell their story for generations to come, but for Duncan, it was no longer just a story. It was his truth. And as he turned to walk back into the forest, he knew that he was finally in the right place. A place where he no longer hunted, but simply observed, listened, and learned from the world around him. The wolves, the horse, and the forest had changed him. And in doing so, they had taught him the greatest lesson of all, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be experienced.